Labor costs may be the only business input that has feelings. Feelings of value, feelings of worth. But what actually goes into determining why people are paid what they're paid? Here now to help answer that, Rafael Gomez. He is Professor of Employment Relations at the University of Toronto and the author of The Little Black Book for Managers. Good to see you again, Rafael, here at TVO.
Thanks, Steve.
When did we first see an economy start to think about the idea of regulating wages?
Sure. I can give you two answers, okay? The real historical answer is always. You know, I'm no expert on this issue, but I have done a bit of delving into the story because I have to teach my students the origins of sort of institutions that regulate the labor market. And in fact, you go back to Egyptian hieroglyphs, and they're actually, you know, the myth was that the slaves built the pyramids. No, you needed skilled labor to build pyramids. And there are actually hieroglyphs that detail what wages or what you would pay sort of workers in doing the task. And there were divisions of labor. So more skilled craftsmen would be paid differentials. So that goes back.
Don't tell me they had a minimum wage back then.
No, I won't go that far.
Okay.
Yeah, and there was no commission by the Egyptian pharaoh to
Okay.
sort of set the wage. But there's always been, and there's a precept in law, as opposed to economics, that actually reverses the idea that, in fact, you need institutions before you have markets. It's called legal realism. And so there's that issue that there's always been some regulation. In the modern era, we'll say the industrial era, after the Industrial Revolution, calls for regulating labor markets and wages and the setting of minimum wages happen in England and other continental European countries that are industrializing, but England principally, because it's the first country that witnessed the Industrial Revolution. Mm-hmm. And you look at coal fields in Wales, and workers were demanding fair wages and minimum standards, both in terms of how much to be paid, but how many hours. You know, going back to the 1800s, mid to late 1800s.
Okay. As you consider the cost of business and all of the different factors that involves, the cost of labor, is that a variable just like any other?
Yes and no. You know, Janet Yellen, who's the recent Federal Reserve.
Not ours, theirs.
I know, but ours in many ways.
Chairman of the Fed in the States.
What happens, that's right, the chairman of the Fed in the States, the first women Fed chair. Actually, her academic career was built on understanding labor markets and writing papers that were a little heterodox for the rest of the economics profession, ahead of her time, really, because now we've come full circle, and I think you've had Dan Ariely on the show, but this new behavioral economics, the mixing of psychology and economics. Well, she wrote a paper about wages as gifts. The idea that firms, smart firms, pay employees more than they're actually worth, seemingly, on the market, in order to what? When you get something you didn't expect and it's better than you thought, you have this need to reciprocate, sort of a psychological mechanism.
So you'll perform better.
So this idea that wages can somehow be a tool that can be used by far-sighted or progressive management is something that's worked its way into now almost standard economics, but 30, 40 years ago was very kind of off the wall.
I'm plucking numbers out of thin air here, but how does the University of Toronto, for example, determine that a professor of employment relations is worth $125,000 a year or whatever? So
I think you got to think of two forces that determine a wage, and I think, or maybe we'll classify them as two forces. One, market forces. There are market signals. For example, if U of T offered, say, a wage that was too low, and then said we want to hire a tenured professor, they wouldn't get the right number of applicants or the quality of applicants they want, so they raise it. Of course, what are they judging by? What is too low, what is too high? They're looking around, comparator schools. And so sometimes those comparisons, only looking at each other, create wage profiles that might be insulated from real market pressures. And you have this division in universities today. We have a lot of teaching being done by non-tenured professors who are cobbling together 3, 4, 5, 6 courses and earning a third of what a tenured prof is. So there's a model there in which what economists have called dual labor market. A labor market for good jobs with lots of protection and lots of good benefits and good wages, and then this market that's really not sheltered by those goodies, shall we say, and is more market driven. You're paid per course. You're judged every year. If your performance dips, then they can cut off the contract without paying you due notice, the common law protection. So there's a dual labor market. In one labor market, there is some market signals, but they're muted. Much more institutional variables determine your wage. That is kind of, we have a union or a faculty association that protects us to a certain extent, and norms, social norms around what you should pay. And indeed, at the University of Toronto, depending on which faculty you work in, which department, huge differentials. and yet the material that you're teaching and the amount of work that you're doing is almost the same.
I assume geography has a factor as well. Somebody going to teach economics at the University of Toronto could get a better salary than somebody teaching economics at Mount Allison in Sackville, New Brunswick?
Yes, and that would be, why would that be? So there would be a differential because the University of Toronto has more resources, it's a larger school. In fact, one of the biggest determinants of wages generally in the economy is the size of the workplace, the size of the firm. And that sort of is an interesting variable because if it's market forces pushing and determining your wage, you'd expect that those wages over time would come down. In other words, there'd be a flood of applicants. The large employer could then offer lower wages. But you're right, this mobility, unlike any other factor that can move instantaneously, if it's capital or a trade, labor doesn't move instantaneously and there are costs. And so those things can be.
Okay, all those criteria that you just gave, the example we gave is the post-secondary sector, where wages for skilled professors with special knowledge could be higher. What about if we're talking about you work at Second Cup, you work at Starbucks? Do the philosophies you just pointed out also work in that context?
To some extent, actually Starbucks sort of prides itself on some measure of what economists call internal labor market. In other words, you could start off just as the barista doing nothing but, putting a cappuccino together. And if you wanted to then not just do that, you can become the manager of the store. And if you still like to be part of the Starbucks family, there's room to move up to a kind of a regional person who's taking care of not just one Starbucks, but several. So there are pathways, even in what seems like a retail or a sort of a hospitality sector, low-wage ghetto, to move up. And the incentives are that as you're promoted, you're earning greater wages and better benefits, but you have more responsibility. So.
Okay, tell me, here's another comparison we hear all the time. The Major League Baseball player who makes $20 million a year, and frankly, outside of the entertainment value of watching that person play, doesn't make a massive contribution to the betterment of society. Versus the child care worker or somebody working in a senior's home who might make $30 or $35 or $40,000 a year, and really when you think about the work they do, it's harder and it's more valuable to us as a society. Why such a differential in the wages there?
Well, the obvious answer is that we pay large amounts of money to go see the stars perform on a daily basis. There are huge television revenue contracts, and there's a monopoly, a protected monopoly in sport. That's, as we know here in the GTA, we could tolerate a few more professional teams, can't we? And yet there's blocked entry. So you have this growth in the number of spectators who are interested in these sports, and yet
an artificially constrained
monopoly, which can therefore, and with a monopoly, what happens is you can raise prices. In this case, because players, this is a new phenomenon. For the bulk of their history, it's only in the last 30, 40 years that players have received these salaries. I don't know if you saw in the paper, Randy Carlyle had a statement about the salaries on his top line. They just lost.
That's right.
And the sort of idea...
This was a few weeks ago when they weren't playing well.
That's right. And he said, well, just look at the salaries of our top players and see what I expect from them.
Right.
And someone wrote back, you should never say that you're jealous of your players and you're a coach. But his last year, he earned $200,000. He was a Norris Trophy winner, 92, 93. In today's value, it would be like $300,000. He's a $2-3 million defenseman if he was playing today.
Right.
So player salaries have really exploded. Why? Because they've had institutions to help them receive those wages. Unions. The National Players Association in baseball is the strongest union, the longest established, and it's managed to take those huge rents that are generated by this monopoly, which is professional baseball, and instead of only going to one party, the owners, they've managed to wrench some of that money into their hands, into the hands of the players. And there's also kind of a theory about how, when you have small differences in talent, in the past, those small differences in talent were remunerated a little bit more. But when the markets have gotten so big, it's gone so global, there's so much money on the table, those small differences now explode. So it's called the economics of superstars.
Okay, I got a minute left here, and let's put one more thing on the table.
Sure.
How good are we at evaluating what we ought to be paid?
I think very poorly. And I'll give you an example. Sorry, we're going to bore people with sports metaphors. But the whole premise behind the film Moneyball and the whole theory was that this was a team, this is the story of Billy Beane, who took over a team that had no money, Oakland, and yet brought them into the championships many years straight. In fact, just past
Made the
year.
playoffs many years in a row.
Yeah, they still haven't won the Holy Grail. That you had to win the last game of the season.
They win way more than they should, given the size of their salary structure.
And what he found was there was undervalued talent. All kinds of biases were introduced into the professional baseball system by scouts who looked at certain criteria that statistically didn't matter in terms of generating wins. So he looked at the data, and we know the story for those of you who've seen the film, and those of you not. He just looked at the data, and he found players that were severely undervalued. If you came from a college system, the professional leagues didn't recognize that. You were a college player, you weren't valued as much. And yet he found that you could get the same amount of talent, and it was being paid much less, and get them to play for Oakland. So I think there are all kinds of reasons why we're not paid what we're worth. Either too much in some cases, and oftentimes too little.
Gotcha. Speaking of too little time. But we'll have you back. You know, you've been back here many times.
Thanks, Steve.
Rafael Gomez from the University of Toronto. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.